Let me start with a truth that many men never hear, not because it isn't real, but because it's uncomfortable to admit. A woman can care deeply about you and still take you for granted. Those two things can exist at the same time. And more often than not, it happens quietly, without intention, without malice, and without awareness. Most men assume that if a woman pulls away, becomes distant, or stops appreciating their effort, it means she never truly valued them. That's not always true. Sometimes it's not a lack of feeling. It's familiarity. It's emotional comfort. It's the assumption that you'll always be there, steady and consistent, no matter how little is given in return. This isn't about blaming women, and it's not about turning men into victims. It's about understanding a dynamic that plays out every day in relationships. When someone gives consistently without boundaries, their value slowly fades into the background. Not because it isn't important, but because it feels guaranteed. And here's the part most men don't realize. The moment that dynamic changes, the moment you stop chasing, stop explaining, stop overextending, something shifts internally. Not externally at first, but emotionally. The silence starts doing what words never could. This video is about that shift, about what actually happens in a woman's mind and heart when a good man finally steps back. Not from theory, not from cliches, but from emotional reality. Because understanding this truth doesn't just bring clarity, it helps you reclaim your self-respect, your balance, and your power. Most men think a woman starts missing them during arguments, emotional conversations, or dramatic goodbyes. In reality, that's rarely when it happens. The moment it truly begins is much quieter. It starts when you stop reaching out, when your name no longer appears on her phone, when the messages, check-ins, and small updates suddenly disappear. At first, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like confusion, a brief pause, a passing thought. Why hasn't he texted today? But that question doesn't stay small for long, it grows. The silence settles in, not around her, but inside her. She starts checking her phone more often, refreshing messages, watching your stories without reacting, paying attention in ways she never did when your presence felt guaranteed. Many women are used to being pursued, used to consistency, used to knowing a man will show up even when she's distant or emotionally unpredictable. And when that consistency is always there, it creates a sense of control. Comfort turns into expectation. Expectation slowly turns into entitlement, not consciously, but emotionally. So when you stop, it disrupts that emotional rhythm. The power balance shifts. She expected you to hold on. She expected you to chase harder. But instead, you chose silence. And that choice forces her to feel the absence of something she didn't realize she depended on. That's when the missing begins. Not because you're trying to provoke a reaction, but because your absence creates space. Space for reflection, space for awareness, space for her to recognize that the attention, stability, and emotional presence she once overlooked are no longer freely available. And once that realization sets in, it can't be undone. When a woman begins to miss a man she took for granted, it's rarely about the grand gestures. It's not the expensive dates, the dramatic moments, or the big promises that resurface first. What comes back are the small, quiet things, the ones that felt ordinary at the time because they happened consistently. She remembers how you checked in without being asked, how you noticed changes in her mood before she ever explained them, how you listened, not just to respond, but to understand. She remembers the emotional safety you provided, the patience you showed during her difficult moments, and the way you made her feel seen without demanding anything in return. At the time, those things blended into the background. Familiarity softened their impact. Consistency became expected. And without realizing it, appreciation faded into assumption. She didn't question your effort because it felt guaranteed. You were steady, you were present, you were reliable. And in that reliability, your value slowly became invisible. But once you're gone, the contrast appears. She starts noticing what's missing. Conversations feel shallower. Attention feels conditional. Emotional connection feels rushed or surface level. And that's when comparison begins. Not intentionally, but instinctively. She realizes that not every man offers depth. Not every man pays attention. Not every man shows up emotionally. And suddenly, the things she once overlooked become the very things she can't replace. That's when regret quietly enters the picture. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a slow realization that she didn't lose someone who simply liked her. She lost someone who genuinely cared. And by the time that truth settles in, you're no longer there to remind her what she had. When the realization begins to set in, most women don't show it right away. In fact, the first response is often the opposite of what you'd expect. On the surface, she looks fine, calm, unaffected. She may post more, go out more, or act as if nothing has changed. Not because she's truly over you, but because appearing unbothered feels safer than admitting loss. This is a defense mechanism, a way to protect pride and emotional control. Admitting that a good man mattered more than expected requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels risky, especially when she isn't sure whether you still care. So instead of reaching out, she distracts herself. Attention becomes a temporary shield. Validation becomes a short-term comfort. But internally, it's a different story. Conversations replay in her mind. Moments resurface. She starts wondering if she misread your patience, if she mistook emotional consistency for weakness, if she pushed too far without realizing it. And the more you stay silent, the louder those thoughts become. What unsettles her most isn't that you left, it's that you didn't chase. She expected reassurance. She expected you to fight harder. And when that didn't happen, uncertainty replaced confidence. She watches from a distance, not to intrude, but to understand where she stands. And when there's no signal, no reaction, no emotional access, anxiety grows. Because the absence of your attention forces her to confront something uncomfortable. You might actually be gone. And once that possibility feels real, pretending to be unbothered becomes much harder to maintain. As the distance continues, an internal conflict begins to take shape. On one side is the ego, the part that wants to stay composed, avoid accountability, and protect pride at all costs. The ego says, don't reach out, don't admit fault. If he cared, he would come back. It clings to control because control feels like safety. On the other side is emotion, and emotion doesn't argue logically. It surfaces unexpectedly. Late at night, during quiet moments, when something reminds her of you, a place, a song, a memory. Emotion doesn't care about pride or appearances. It only responds to what was felt. At first, ego holds the upper hand. She tells herself she did nothing wrong, that things ended naturally, that moving on is the right choice. But emotion keeps pressing. It asks uncomfortable questions. Was I too distant? Did I expect too much without giving enough? Did I mistake his effort for something I could afford to lose? That's when the balance starts to shift. The longer you remain emotionally unavailable, the harder it becomes for ego to maintain the illusion of control. Small actions begin to appear. Watching your stories, revisiting old photos, sending a casual message that says very little but means far more. These aren't always attempts to reconnect fully. Often they're tests, quiet ways to see if the door is still open, if access to you still exists. But when those attempts meet emotional distance instead of reassurance, emotion takes over completely. Because ego can delay regret, but it can't erase it. And once emotion wins, the realization becomes unavoidable. Losing you wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a consequence. The missing doesn't always hit immediately after the distance begins. Sometimes it arrives later, in a moment that feels small but lands heavy. It happens when she sees that you didn't fall apart, that you didn't pause your life, that you didn't wait. She notices it in subtle ways. You seem calmer, more grounded, focused. There's no bitterness, no indirect messages, no need to prove anything. You're simply moving forward. And that's what makes it different. This isn't performance, it's progress. That realization triggers something deep. Because as long as you seemed emotionally available, there was a sense of influence, a belief that you'd always be within reach. But seeing you thrive without her removes that sense of control. It forces her to confront a new reality. Your growth didn't depend on her presence. And that shift is unsettling. Not because she wants you to struggle, but because she assumed she mattered more than she did. She assumed your happiness was tied to her validation. Watching you succeed without it challenges that belief. What makes this moment powerful is that it can't be undone. Confidence earned through self-growth isn't something that can be reclaimed through attention or charm. She recognizes the difference between a man trying to impress and a man who has outgrown the need to. And that's when reflection deepens. She starts reevaluating her role in the dynamic, not just what she lost, but why she lost it. The man she once overlooked is no longer standing still, and seeing you in motion, aligned with your own life, transforms missing into something heavier, the awareness that you may never return to who you once were. Silence from a man who once cared deeply is more powerful than most people realize. It's not dramatic, it's not confrontational, but it creates something far more unsettling: space. And in that space, reflection becomes unavoidable. When you stop reacting, stop explaining, and stop trying to fix what wasn't being valued, the emotional noise disappears. There's no reassurance to lean on, no confirmation to soothe uncertainty. And without that emotional feedback, she's left alone with her thoughts. That's when the questions begin. Why hasn't he reached out? Did I misjudge him? Is he truly done? Even if she was the one who pulled away first, your continued silence starts to feel different. It no longer feels like distance. It feels like finality. What many men don't understand is that silence removes emotional leverage. It takes away the ability to influence, redirect, or soften the outcome. And for someone who assumed access to your attention, that loss of influence can feel deeply unsettling. As days pass without contact, reflection deepens. She revisits moments she dismissed, words she didn't mean but never took back, efforts she accepted without acknowledging. And the absence of your presence turns those memories into lessons. Your silence isn't punishment. It's clarity. It signals that your emotional energy is no longer available to anyone who doesn't value it. And once that realization sets in, it changes how she sees you. Not as someone she can pull back when convenient, but as someone who chose self-respect over emotional overextension. That understanding is what transforms missing into regret. Because silence doesn't argue, it simply reveals. There's a difficult truth many men avoid confronting. How you allow yourself to be treated teaches others what you believe you deserve. When you consistently give more than you receive, tolerate emotional inconsistency, or stay present where you're not appreciated, you unintentionally lower your perceived value. This isn't about blame. It's about awareness. Emotional availability without boundaries doesn't create security. It creates familiarity. And familiarity, when unchecked, can turn into complacency. When someone knows you'll always show up regardless of how they behave, there's little incentive to rise to your level. Over time, effort begins to feel optional. Respect becomes conditional. And before you realize it, you're no longer being chosen. You're being kept around. The shift doesn't happen when you demand appreciation or seek validation. It happens when you withdraw your energy from spaces where it isn't reciprocated, not out of anger, not as a tactic, but as an act of self-alignment. When you stop overextending, something changes. Your presence carries weight, your attention feels earned, not assumed. And that shift is felt immediately because it's rooted in self-respect, not strategy. A woman can only take a man for granted if he gives her the opportunity to do so. The moment you stop negotiating your worth through patience and sacrifice, the dynamic recalibrates. Whether she rises to meet you or fades away, the outcome serves the same purpose. Because the man who knows his value doesn't need to prove it. He simply lives in alignment with it.